Thanks so much, Rachel, and thanks everyone for joining to talk about shorebirds. I love talking about shorebirds, so I'm going to jump in and try to share my screen. Let's thumbs up. Can you see a black-necked stilt? All right. So let's get to presentation mode there. And here we go. So I'm going to talk about shorebirds and really history of shorebird conservation, really primarily through the lens of my organization, Point Blue Conservation Science, talking about the Central Valley and then really beyond in our whole history of shorebird conservation. First, though, I want to talk just a little bit about myself, give you an idea of how I got here, and really just share this quote with you that I've always fallen back on since I was probably in my early 20s. I was really starting to explore the world and get out in the world. And just this quote here from D.H. Lawrence, and I never saw a wild thing sorry for itself. Small bird will drop frozen dead from a bow without ever having felt sorry for itself. And this really just, I think, personifies wildlife and their resiliency and their adaptability. And what's always really inspired me about animals in the natural world, and really getting into their heads and trying to understand and be inspired by, by their existence. So I'll also bring you back to my beginnings. My beginnings were really in rural New Mexico. And I think where it all came from with my inspiration for birds was really a chicken coop. And as about a 10-year-old kid in this picture here, having the responsibility of taking care of chickens and feeding them day and night, having them incubate eggs and produce young, seeing that magic of life hatching out of an egg, and also having to put down some that were sick and injured, and seeing that whole cycle of life and really just their entire life and getting in, into their worlds. And that, I think, really laid a foundation for me, just kind of thinking a bit like an animal and being able to kind of get into their heads a little bit. I then moved to the East Coast for most of the rest of my schooling and undergrad, not as much wild space in that part of the world. Once I finished my undergrad, I traveled out west thinking I wanted to study birds. Wasn't really sure exactly what direction that would go. Went to grad school at Oregon State, studying seabirds, and then ended up landing a job with Point Blue Conservation Science about 10 years ago, studying migratory shorebirds, which is something I was always inspired by, just the epic migrations and long distances that these birds travel, the adaptability they have to show up in a place and just not know what's going to be there. And that really just inspired me to really go after the job and stick around with it. It's really been inspiring, and I've found a lot of amazing inspirational points in my life in the last 10 years. But so quickly, just about Point Blue, as many of you might know, we were founded in 1965 as Point Reyes Bird Observatory, grown quite a bit since then. Currently have over 160 seasonal full-time staff, with really a goal working to reduce the impacts of environmental change and promote nature-based solutions for wildlife and people. And I'm going to jump into our more current event, ongoing ecological disaster down at Huntington Beach, and give you an idea of really how we fit in there and how this response to an oil spill happens. And this gives you an idea of really our organization's engagement with this, and how the network actually formed to respond to oil spills back in 1971, 50 years ago now, was Standard Oil, giant ecological disaster in the San Francisco Bay Area when 2 oil tankers collided. Our organization responded to that, was on leading front lines recovering old wildlife. That disaster led to legislation that funded what is now the Oil Wildlife Care Network and Oil Spill Response Network that I'll touch on in a minute. This gives you a bit of timeline of our organization's history, where we've been engaged in oil spill recovery efforts ever since then, leading trainings across the state. We've been deployed to this will be now the 18th actually oil spill that our organization has been deployed to, and including an additional 3 internationally significant spills, Exxon Valdez, Deepwater Horizon, for example, there. And briefly about this oiled wildlife response network, it's really considered the most advanced in the world. As I said, now it's 50 years in the making. And this rescue and documentation, many details about all the birds and fish and marine mammals that are recovered. It's all legally mandated and can be used in subsequent legal actions. The response network really follows the incident command system, which is how FEMA and other agencies respond to disasters, earthquakes, and floods. It gives a hierarchical structure to bring together the different entities, county, local, state, federal, volunteers, gives a venue and a structure to have leadership and communication, lines of communication. So we've applied this to oil spills. It's been relatively successful. There are now full-time positions across the state, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and their oil spill prevention and response department. They oversee the entire network and the funding for it. Out of UC Davis Veterinary Medicine Department, that is where the Oiled Wildlife Care Network, the partnership network, is housed and coordinated. And a lot of the trainings really go through them. Everyone in the network stays up to date on their training. We have HAZWOPER trainings for hazardous, because oil is a hazardous substance, have us aware for all the dangers in response and be updated on our training to even be able to respond. And the network is made up of a whole long list of partner organizations. You can see in the white, these are all of the different partner organizations that are involved in the network. Some have a lot more say in the network than others, a lot more people involved. The blue off to the left of the state, those are actually facilities that are identified to process and house oiled wildlife in the event of a disaster. So really almost anywhere in the state that there is a disaster with oil, there'll be people nearby to respond, and the network and the response plan is already there. And for the Huntington Beach spill, within 24 hours, the incident command system was set up, and there were people on the ground responding to wildlife needs. Quick overview of what just happened. So with the spill, almost immediate activation. If it reaches the threshold of activation, then several partner organizations will be activated more. If it's a bigger spill, Point Blue is almost immediately deployed for the Huntington Beach spill. I'm actually on the East Coast right now visiting family, or I would be in Huntington Beach helping with wildlife recovery and processing. But once people get deployed, there's a whole aspect of hazing that tries to keep wildlife away from oiled areas, so keep them from actually getting oil on them if we can. And then people out surveying, looking for oiled wildlife to report to recovery teams to go out and actually actively try and track wildlife that need help and that are oiled. If we can catch them, they go into one of the facilities that were on the list and they get processing. There's a whole long list of metrics that are taken about the birds and measurements to understand exactly how they're being impacted. And then they move into the actual washing and waterproofing, because as most of you might know, oil, especially on waterbird feathers, is really detrimental. Those feathers are their protection. That is what keeps them warm. It keeps the water out and the warmth in. And once you get oil on it, that just breaks down that barrier, and then that individual is in trouble. And then ideally the last step is release. If we can get, there's already been some animals released from the spill down on Huntington Beach. Where Point Blue comes in is really on the wildlife recovery and processing aspect of our superpower, really being studying birds, capturing birds, and handling birds. We also have this really strong partnership and experience in partnerships, so we do help a lot of the coordination as well. So some quick updated numbers about the incident that's going on in Huntington Beach. This is from yesterday, so I don't have updated numbers from today, but there are some predictable trends really emerging. As you can see on the bird side, the last few days, there's been quite a bit more dead birds recovered. That's very predictable in that often it can take days, if not weeks, for an oiled bird, if it had just a little bit, before it was weak enough to either be captured or it then was succumbed to the impacts from oil on its feathers. So we'll expect to continue to see more birds and other wildlife recovered dead, particularly in the next week or two, likely. And then also birds recovered alive. There have been very few in the last few days. That's actually a good sign. At this point, it doesn't look like the worst case scenario in Huntington Beach. That said, there's still weeks, if not months, to play out for this type of disaster. And as I mentioned, it can take weeks, if not a month or two, for a bird that has oil on it for it actually to become weak enough to be captured. So there's still quite a bit of time here to see really what the impacts are to wildlife. Some of the first signs are that it's not the worst case scenario, yet we are prepared for that. A little bit on the numbers of, also there's been at least 19 bird species that we know have been impacted, including the federally endangered western snowy plover. As you can see, these are photographs that our organization took. There was this LA Times article that these pictures were in. That's a snowy plover there on the left being taken, that was captured by one of my colleagues. And then on the right, there's Diana Humble, another one of my colleagues who leads our coordination through at Point Blue and leads a lot of trainings throughout the Oil Wildlife Care Network. And she's one of the lead processors and handlers and organizing all of the collection of data. All right, so that's all for oil spill. Be happy to answer questions a little bit later. I'm going to jump more into our organization and kind of our history of avian conservation and how we got to be some of the leaders in shorebird conservation. And it really just shows why we're at the top of the list for oil spill response. It's because of our history and history of integrity in bird research. We have a long-term land bird monitoring program at the Palomrin Field Station, where our organization was founded. You can see there on the left, that is actually a picture of someone we've already mentioned, a young David Sibley extracting a passerine from a mist net at our Palomrin Field Station in 1965, the year our organization was founded. And then in 1972, we moved our office there on the right to the Pike County Gulch area, right on the Bolinas Lagoon, on the shores of the Bolinas Lagoon, an estuary, the Point Reyes Peninsula. And then in 1972, that began a long-term monitoring effort for water birds on Bolinas Lagoon. So our second long-term monitoring data set was initiated then. I'm not going to jump into the science here, but this was a publication back in 2017 or 18 from some of our early wetland ecologists, Gary Page, Lynn Stencil, and Dave Shuford, that really was showing the power of this long-term data set at Bolinas Lagoon, monitoring water birds from 1972 through 2015, and relating that to climate impacts. In this case, was the majority of the species had a strong relationship to amounts of rainfall and their abundance within the estuary. And this is just a great example of how these long-term data sets are really emerging as in importance in conservation of an environment, because we need to have context of how was the climate decades ago. Things are changing so fast. These long-term data sets are becoming more and more valuable, and they're quite rare overall. And a quick example here too, even just understanding how abundance in this estuary changed was, you can see for Dunlin there's a pretty good decline that started in about the 1990s. And we know then that was actually when rice field management changed quite a bit in the Central Valley, from predominantly burning the fields for post-harvest treatment to flooding them, which is a great attractant to especially Dunlin in particular. And so that could be indicative of of a population decline, but also we know management of the landscape potentially can really impact the distribution of some of these species. Another long-term data set that we have was initiated in the late 1970s, studying western snowy plovers in Monterey Bay. And this project was really the first to document just basic ecology of this species, and then went on to start to document a local population decline, and really this basic ecology and understand that these birds might be in trouble laid the foundation really for their listing as Threatened and Endangered Species Act in the 1990s, and then to their ongoing recovery. Here's a graph of the population that we have monitored in Monterey Bay. This is actually a pretty precise estimates. We have monitored them to a level to where we're able to count every individual bird throughout the bay. We've lost that ability a little bit in like the last year or two, but we have this from 1985 through 2019-20, a really good look at this population, and we see the impacts of conservation efforts, and we see a population recovering and actually getting to the population target in 2003, 10 years after the bird was listed. The population remained around the target until recently. From its peak in about 2015, we've now had 2021 was the 6th straight year of very poor reproduction for the birds. And as we can predict based on our reproductive data, the population is declining and will continue to decline. And it's primarily because of corvid impacts to nesting success. Ravens in particular are really ravaging the breeding population there. And right now we don't have a way to solve that. And this population will continue to decline, at least in the short term, until we can figure out some type of conservation solution to corvid impacts. Another example of our work was the Pacific Flyway Project. This was really the first complete census of shorebird sites throughout the Pacific Flyway portion, the United States portion of the Pacific Flyway. This occurred from the late 90s to the late 80s to the mid 1990s. And it was really the earliest recognitions of the need for more large, broad-scale flyway conservation for migratory shorebirds. You can't just conserve migratory shorebirds in one site. You need to think big. And this was really the first example of this in the Pacific Flyway, and documenting sites throughout the whole flyway. Identified a lot of sites that were not known to be important to shorebirds. It also is an example of just creating a broad-scale partnership network. This utilized a lot of volunteers across the whole West and a lot of partner biologists to make this survey happen. You can see on the right a figure from just the Intermountain West portion of that, and documenting important sites for the blackneck stilt. And next, in the early 2000s, Mills Warnock and partners initiated a Pacific Flyway migration ecology study, being one of the first to track migratory movements of western sandpipers and dunlin from places in Baja and California northward in spring, and actually documenting them using some of the more important estuaries up the coast into Alaska. The first really large-scale study like this in the Pacific Flyway on shorebirds. They also were capturing birds and taking blood samples and analyzing how their physiology changed across the latitudes as they moved north. They were also sampling the mudflats and the substrate. What are they eating? Is it common in between these different places? And found some commonalities in some of the families of invertebrates that these species were targeting in the different estuaries. Now moving on to more recent years, and around 2010 or so, with the Migratory Bird Conservation Partnership, which is really getting more folks into the Central Valley now. The S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation stepped up and identified Audubon, California, Point Blue, and the Nature Conservancy as having great superpowers as NGOs, but potentially combined even more so, leveraging the great outreach of Audubon and the science of Point Blue, a lot of the policy making and influence of Nature Conservancy, and bringing all of us together with a vision of making California's Central Valley having a thriving bird population, sustainable water for wildlife and people, and also be climate resilient. There's three main arms of that. Initially, securing water for wildlife refuges. A lot of those policies are now in place. Still a bit of a struggle to actually make it happen, but that was some big wins for birds initially in this partnership. Also, a lot of work on working lands, and we know that California is the world's biggest farm, and we did a lot of work in agriculture to understand how they can tweak their management practices, particularly in rice fields and other agriculture that uses flooding, even if it's post-harvest or sometimes post-flooding, pre-planting, and just understanding how can they just change their management practices a little bit to benefit birds more. If they say draw down their rice fields a little bit later in the spring, or maybe do a step drawdown, draw like one down, draw one down today, the next one the next day, and just give this variety of different flooding for the birds to utilize. Also, a whole arm of public policy that's primarily the Nature Conservancy, and they've done an amazing job really moving forward conservation and using birds as indicators of our environment and having that become one of the foundations of environmental conservation in California. So on to some examples of really more of the ecology type research that we've focused on through the partnership. One of the first projects was really understanding the Longbilled Dowitcher and some of their migration ecology. And so back in 2012, this is really when I was first hired to help lead this. We were capturing and measuring and radio tagging dowitchers at their fall stopover in the upper Klamath Basin. And we know adult shorebirds undergo a complete pre-basic molt after breeding. So they're going to breed all of their feathers by the time winter comes. That includes all of their flight feathers as well. Different species have a lot of different ways that they do that. They can do it before migration, they can do it after migration, and some actually do it during their migration. A lot of waterfowl are really known to undertake what we call a molt migration, when that's stop going to a particular place to molt and then moving on to a wintering place. So a molt migration, kind of a staging area, so it's not a wintering area. And this is really what we found at the upper Klamath Basin. We were documenting, this is essentially the dates on the bottom and the molt stage on the left, and we were documenting the full range of primary molt stage for dowitchers from early August through the end of September. And we were seeing, as you can see that picture on the bottom there, dowitchers have 10 primary feathers. There were some that we were finding with 4. They were molting a lot of their feathers at once, which really indicates they weren't planning on leaving and going anywhere anytime soon. They were still able to fly, but flying any long distances with those few primaries would be really inefficient. We do know some species in waterfowl actually go entirely flightless in the Klamath Basin and some other areas. And this type of strategy really evolves because there's a very reliable food source in the location. So they know and have learned over the years that this location can be very reliable. Said the Klamath Basin has changed a lot, so there's a lot of struggles there for the birds these days. We also wanted to figure out how long are they staying, so we attached radio tags to a lot of the birds. We tracked them through the air, so we're figuring out how many of them were still remaining every few days in the upper Klamath Basin, and we found an average minimum stopover time of 32 days. So the minimum average time was over a month for these birds. Some were staying for, I think the longest stopover we had was almost 70 days. So we had, there were birds, dowitchers staying in this area for quite a long time. We also tracked them into the Central Valley, found that nearly 60% of those dowitchers that we tagged ended up wintering and staying at least through January in the Central Valley. So uncovered really strong migratory connectivity between these two important wetland regions. It's already been documented in the past for a lot of waterfowl, and now really just seeing these dowitchers, a lot of their ecology was a lot more like a duck than other shorebirds in some ways. The next phase of that study was really understanding shorebird movements throughout the Central Valley. So we also focused on longbilled dowitchers, and we're trapping and tagging those in early winter. We tagged over 100 over the course of 3 straight winters. We also tagged over 150 dunlin over the course of those 3 winters, and tracked them really from the Sacramento Valley all the way down to Mendota and into the parts of the San Francisco Bay Area. So we were tracking their movements all winter until they left in the spring. We also wanted to understand what are the drivers of these movements. Why are they? What's really making you move around? You know, we presume it's based somewhat on habitat availability and water, and it's really dynamic at different times of the winter potentially across the valley. So we utilized remote sensing and Landsat data that was able to, we were able to produce maps that estimated where surface water was located across the whole valley, and then average that across different years. And you can see in the map on the bottom right there, the white areas were never flooded. A lot of it's developed or other types of land use. But then in the blue, you really see really consistent habitat up in the far northwest, especially the Sacramento Valley. That's where predicted to be some of the only habitat for the birds this year. And we're able to relate the change of the landscape of water to the distance that these birds are really moving. And then we're also able to relate the configuration of the water on the landscape. And when you have flooded area right next to a flooded area, or you might have more of a checkerboard of flooded area, and how that different type of landscape structure really influenced the birds' movements. And now what we learned from that study is really being applied to a lot of incentive programs that are rolled out to intentionally flood habitat for birds, and doing that smartly, not just doing it wherever anybody can flood, but saying, okay, there's a lot more value if we do it this way. We also, as part of the study, when we tagged the dowitchers and dunlin, did it within 2 different regions of the valley, 2 very different and important regions for shorebirds. Both the Sacramento Valley and the grassland ecological area in the San Joaquin Basin are recognized by the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network as internationally important sites for shorebirds. As we know, the Sacramento Valley is really this much broader extent and amount of flooding. It's a mosaic of flooded wetlands and agriculture. And down in the grassland ecological area, it's really one large contiguous wetland. It's really the largest contiguous freshwater wetland in North America. And we found very different movement ecology between the birds that we tagged in these regions. And you know, in the valley, there's a lot more water, it's a lot more dynamic, it changes. We located almost half of the birds, both dunlin dowitchers that we tagged in the Sacramento Valley, outside of the Sacramento Valley at some point before they left in the spring. Totally opposite for the birds in the grassland ecological area. We located a single one of those. It was a dowitcher that moved right up to the Sacramento Valley after we tagged, I think, in December. So maybe just making a foray from the Sacramento Valley and really just showing that the dunlin and dowitchers that were wintering in the grassland ecological area, they were staying there and not leaving until they departed on migration, likely. So really, really opposite types of movement ecology, and just something we learned of how these birds are using the landscape and how the landscape is really influencing how they're moving about it. The last example, an arm of this study, was really a more local scale study. And this one I was really excited about was just how it's like, where are these birds going at night? We just don't know. And they're not as influenced by tides and foraging as they're on the coast. So really it's just day to night was influencing, and they're moving around between areas. We learned quickly. And on the left, you can see the black dots are areas that we tried to check. We checked to track shorebirds within that area in the afternoon, and then again later that night after sunset. And the figure on the right is a little complex, but I'll try and break it down. And essentially on the left with the white circles, when we located a bird in the the flooded rice in the daytime, 100% of those birds were located in the rice fields at night. That said, we did not locate a bird in the daytime in the rice fields after March 14th because the rice fields had drawn down. There was no more standing water in them. And after March 14th, we're locating them all in the wetlands in the daytime. And there was a period from late March through early April that those birds located in the wetlands, I was still finding them out in almost nearly bone dry flooded rice fields roosting at night. And I was just like, what are they doing out here? They're just spread out in flooded rice fields, hiding, not in big roosts like they typically do in other areas. And was just really interesting. And then until I think it was April 3rd or really in early April, when the rice fields became totally bone dry, then they all moved into the wetlands at night. Actually, a lot of them left the area, and the ones that remained were using the wetlands at night. And what this is really telling us that the birds the Dunlin wanted to be in the rice fields. Also potentially an indicator that the predator pressure and disturbance that they were experiencing within the National Wildlife Refuge was quite a bit more than outside in the rice fields. So really just showing the importance of these rice fields for Dunlin. All right, now I'm going to move on to some of our more modern shorebird monitoring programs. And on the right, you can see, when I say modern, we have a sampling design that is rigorous, that we go through to set up how we are actually sampling the landscape. Every year, surveying the entire Central Valley for shorebirds is not feasible. So we wanted to come up with a way to sample the landscape and still get the answers that we need about changes in the populations. And this is an example of, we used townships that had a certain amount of flooding, and then randomized that, and then randomized routes inside those townships. And down the bottom, you can see some of the ones in the lower delta, and then the bottom left, down the grassland ecological area, where there was a few areas within this random sampling as well. Before I dive into that much, I'm just going to step back really to how we even got to that point. And that's some of these broad scale flyway monitoring programs that we helped develop, and developing some of these flyway protocols with a vision of a coordinated set of monitoring programs across the Pacific Flyway provides a coherent view of shorebird populations and basis for guiding conservation priorities. And we were motivated because the coasts were under threat. We already knew this. Climate change is not a new thing, not even back in 2000. So we know the coasts are under threat, even more so now with expanding human populations, still a lot of development in Latin America on the coast. And also, as we know, the coasts are rising, changing just as quick, if not quicker than anybody thought. And sea level rise is a real thing. So we know that the coasts are really dynamic places now. They're probably one of the most impacted ecosystems on Earth. That then led to the Pacific Flyway Shorebird Survey being initiated in 2010 and 2011. And that was really focusing on all the main estuaries on the coast, and then many interior wetlands, and that includes the Central Valley. And the Fresno Audubon Society has been heavily involved with this survey since its inception. We're so grateful for all of the contributions that many of you here tonight have made to this program. It's this huge network of professional partner biologists going out to conduct shorebird surveys in conjunction alongside skilled volunteers. We have a survey window to take this snapshot between November 15th and December 15th each early winter. That network then grew pretty quickly with help from the David Lucille Packard Foundation, as well as the US federal government and the Forest Service international programs really stepping up to say, hey, we can help them. We can help the birds in the US, but it doesn't do a whole lot of good unless we are helping them down the line too, because most of these birds are are crossing a lot of international boundaries. And we grew what is now the Migratory Shorebird Project to connect communities across the Americas through conservation science and through shorebirds. And we now have over 50 partner organizations within this network. The orange dots you're seeing are actually all of the different survey areas across the whole network. We're now surveying, the survey network includes all 13 countries on the Pacific coast of the Americas, over 80 wetland sites, over 1,500 individual survey units. We're counting over 1 million birds per year, over 500 volunteers and biologists teaming up. There's been already 6 graduate students doing research as part of this network. A quick, non-comprehensive look at just some of the partner organizations. It's broad from NGOs, governments, universities, across the board. And so the objectives really of this Migratory Shorebird Project, which is using the exact same protocols as the Pacific Flyway Shorebird Survey, so they're all the same thing. And we're really trying to quantify trends in the distribution and abundance of shorebirds. We also want to be able to critically evaluate specific hypotheses about critical threats to their populations. We can then take the data to inform conservation through applied science, and then also just sometimes the data speaks for itself. You don't need a whole lot more than just a few surveys to help to tell you something, and I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. And we're also, fourth one, really important, particularly in Latin America, is just increasing the capacity for shorebird research and conservation. A quick look at some of the places we work. Here's up in Puget Sound, nearby in San Francisco Bay, in Panama, in Colombia, in Peru, and there's in Chiloé Island in Chile. I mentioned building capacity. This is a huge part of the Migratory Shorebird Project. This is a picture from just before the pandemic changed our lives back into December 2019 in Guatemala, which was the 13th of 13 countries on the coast to join the network. There was over 30 or almost 40 people involved in this workshop, and it was so cool to just see them learn and then them be able to take what they learned to their local communities and really to start to lay that foundation for environmental conservation. Part of the power of this too is also having accessible data and accessible ways to store data. So everyone across the whole network is putting data into the California Avian Data Center. And this is available in both English and Spanish. All of our survey protocols and materials and trainings are available in English and Spanish to make things equitable across the flyway. And this just shows our quick cycle of collecting data into the online database. We can then retrieve data. We love data sharing for any kind of conservation applications. We're always advertising that these data are available for any conservation application. So anybody has any ideas, hit me up. Also, we have dissemination of data in a few different ways with reports, some of our scientific publications, and you can also preview your data. I'm going to take a little risk here and show you try and show you one of our online applications. Let's see if I can do this without messing it up. Okay, hopefully now you can all see the Pacific Flyway Shorebird Survey website. I'm gonna go up here to explore data. We have an interactive map. This map now shows all of the survey sites similar to that map we were looking at earlier, and with different size circles based on some of the different amounts of birds counted in certain surveys. Well, let's zoom in to your neck of the woods, Central Valley, and some of the nearby sites. So there's Mendota Wildlife Area and the Grassland Ecological Area, but we'll look quickly at Mendota and zoom in there and just pick a unit where it looks like there's been birds counted in the past. And up here, we can see, okay, here's all the species that we've recorded at that individual survey unit. You can break that down by the individual years when there were surveys there. And it was actually a little young counting those raptors at that unit last year. So you can preview the data online really easy. This is a cool tool that our informatics team has put together and continues to work on to improve. All right, now we'll jump back to the presentation. There's just a picture of the map. Some quick examples of just using the data, especially in Latin America. When we rolled out our Nicaragua surveys, we quickly identified the first important shorebird site in Nicaragua. Since then, we've identified some others where shorebirds are using, but one that was really important. So just really novel things in some of these parts of the world where there has not been any kind of standardized approach to understanding what sites are important for shorebirds. And also in Western Mexico, there's been a lot of work on understanding and reducing human disturbance on the coast. There's been several graduate students at universities in Western Mexico that have focused their thesis projects on documenting human disturbance. And also involved as part of those projects have been big teams, as you can see the green jackets down the bottom, actually just going out and engaging in outreach and talking to the people driving on the beach and talking to the people doing some of these really highly disturbing activities in some very sensitive areas, and just spreading the word and having people be more aware there, because there's definitely a different awareness about the environment in some more developing countries. And some of the research is still ongoing and will continue throughout this whole portion of Mexico about human disturbance. There's also been a lot of focus on working lands in Central America, very similar to the Central Valley, but in Central America, it's focused on shrimp farms. There's a lot of shrimp farms on the coast of Western Latin America, Central America in particular, and all of the shrimp farms that we engaged really had not, no one had wildlife even on their mind a little bit, and yet we've been able to identify some small tweaks to some of their practices, just flood down a little bit slower or flood up a little bit slower at different times, that could really have really high value to migratory water birds in places where there's still wetlands being modified and destroyed and developed. So working with producers, and this is really shorebird conservation going into the future, it has to go across not just natural wetlands, but there's a lot of working lands that can also benefit wetland dependent wildlife. In Colombia, they were on board right in 2013, one of our first partners, and surveying throughout the Northern Colombia National Parks, there was really no idea what areas are important, what aren't for water birds, or where is not, and where is important. So they were able to survey comprehensively, come up with areas where they survey regularly now, and really understand which, the relative importance of these different sites throughout Colombia. And this has now fed into protection of certain sites and also fended off development of some areas as well. So really advancing conservation of the coast in Colombia. All right, we'll bring it back now to California. And this is a study that we published a couple of years ago that was looking at using the Pacific Flyway Shorebird Survey data to understand drought effects on shorebirds in the Central Valley and San Francisco Bay Area. And as you can see on these maps of the Central Valley from 2011, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and the different distributions that we found of shorebirds during the survey, with blue being well above average and red being well below average. We classified 2013 through 15 as drought years. The drought peaked in 15. We know that drought effects are they lag in the Central Valley to the greater landscape because the water restrictions really don't become enacted until the reservoirs are down far enough. but yet that's often, well into a drought. So you can see in 2012, despite it really being a drought, there was still a lot of flooding on the landscape. We had a lot of rain as well during the survey period that year. We had really high abundance. And then things changed quickly as the drought really started in 2013. That was the year it didn't rain from, I think, December all the way till like the following November, and had very low abundance. 2014, you can see in the northern portion of the valley and the Delta and the Sacramento Valley, some blue, and that was really indicative of us documenting really large flocks in some of the remaining flooded habitat. So there was a lot less flooded habitat for birds in 2014, but we were documenting these birds still coming back to the Central Valley and really finding them in high densities in the remaining habitat. That all changed by 2015, which was the peak of the drought. There was no flood. Only people that had a lot of money in wells were able to flood for water birds that year, and we had very low abundance across the valley. Things started to rebound a bit in 2016, but again, there's a little bit of a lag before the birds start to move back. We also were able to look at our surveys in the San Francisco Bay Area and the Point Reyes region and leverage the power of this type of network. Okay, well, if they're not there, where did they go? And we found really strong signals of increases in particularly collegious sandpipers, Dunlin especially, had high increases of abundance from 2013 through 15 in the San Francisco Bay Area. Also, as well in the Point Reyes region, there was a similar signal, not as strong for these sandpipers as well. Some of the other focal species for the study were dowitchers and yellowlegs. And those were interesting because we found significant declines during drought, not only in the Central Valley, but also in the San Francisco Bay region too. So just telling us that there was considerable declines in those species during drought in both of these regions, even one that has consistent habitat in the San Francisco Bay area, and giving us an idea that they're potentially more vulnerable to drought than some other species. So now on to today, and really what's going to be our focus for the next several years in shorebird conservation. We know there's a very severe drought right now in California. It has been increasing in severity for several years. We hope it's not going to continue. This year was predicted to be very similar to 2015, with water cut off to essentially all farmers to flood post-harvest for water birds in the Central Valley. It happens to have coincided with a budget surplus, slightly related to COVID, for the state. And there's been a much bigger response to drought. And this is in part because of that study and some other research that's gone on from during this last drought cycle to really understand how it's impacting wildlife. And now, right now, the state of California and the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Department of Water Resources, and then the Migratory Bird Conservation Partnership, which is officially over, but our organizations are continuing to collaborate at the same level for birds in the valley and beyond. And as this program and funding and support from the state to flood habitat for water birds this winter, and then also conduct biological monitoring to understand, are we actually helping the birds and how much? And this is using shorebirds as sentinels of the environmental change. That had not happened really before this, but we have this PFSS survey framework already in place. We don't need to design anything new. And for this type of emergency response, that's exactly what is needed, is something already in place. You can fall back on that. We don't have time to design something new to understand this. And the state recognizes that and is leveraging our network to help understand this drought this winter. We're also going to be engaged in some additional research around this to better understand not just how the birds are moving, their distribution and abundance, and how that's shifting on the landscape, but how is it actually impacting the individual birds. It's a bit of a black box. We don't really understand how the birds are really reacting to this type of limited habitat on the landscape. So beginning in mid-November through the next 3 winters, we're going to be capturing, measuring, and then analyzing the physiological condition of shorebirds using blood samples. And this is going to occur in the Central Valley. We are also partnering with multiple people in coastal California, in coastal British Columbia, coastal Baja, to be sampling blood from shorebirds and comparing it to the birds in the Central Valley to give us this idea of, okay, we know these birds in the Central Valley some of them are gonna be there. We're gonna understand what their body condition is, but we don't really know what that means if we don't have somewhere to compare it to. We'll have somewhere such as British Columbia, where those birds shouldn't have been affected by drought. They didn't go much further south. They didn't even make it to Washington State. So then we also have birds down in Baja that'll be wintering that potentially came through California in a very drought-stricken environment to get to their wintering area on the coast. So we're going to have the suite of physiological data on shorebirds to better understand really how this type of drought, which is really a mega drought across the entire Western United States, has potentially been impacting migratory shorebirds at the individual level. We are also beginning to roll out a redo of what I mentioned earlier, the Pacific Flyway Project back in the early 90s in the Intermountain West portion of the United States. So essentially from the crest of the Sierras to the crest of the Rockies. And we're going to be redoing that portion of those surveys. And as we know, the Migratory Shorebird Project and Pacific Flyway Shorebird Survey are really focused on the west side of the mountains, nothing on the east side, and there's not a lot of nothing at this broad of scale surveying for shorebirds throughout that entire portion of the Pacific Flyway. So beginning really in 2022, and ideally if we can garner the full support for the project for 4 to 5 years after that, documenting the distribution and abundance of shorebirds across the entire Intermountain West, and including all 12 states. We'll ideally get it a little bit internationally into Canada and Mexico too as we build this out. But again, this is being funded by the federal government and state governments, recognizing shorebirds are sentinels of this changing environment. What we're planning to do by redoing these surveys that were done 30 years ago is give a great look of how have these sites changed in 30 years. And in the early 1990s is when the no net loss wetlands policy was really enacted in the United States. So those surveys back then didn't have a chance to document any of the changes from this policy. So since then, we know there have been a lot of wetland protection, a lot of wetland restoration, but a lot less freshwater. The climate has been ravaging freshwater resources in the interior West. So there's less water, but there's a lot more wetland protection. So by redoing the survey, we're going to get this retrospective look to understand how the distribution and abundance of shorebirds across this vast area has changed over the past 30 years. To do this, we're going to use a very similar network to our current Pacific Flyway Shorebird survey and the exact same protocol. So we'll be implementing these flyway level standardized protocols, and we'll be partnering with the National Audubon Society and engaging local Audubon trappers across all of these 12 states to help us and their skilled volunteers to conduct surveys at some of these sites. Also engaging a lot of different NGO, government, university partners across this whole area to, one, increase capacity, but also build out a network to hopefully, in the long run, set up a monitoring program along the same lines as the Pacific Flyway Shorebird Survey. So we are actually potentially monitoring the entire flyway, at least in the US and ideally beyond. So we just started pulling out our call for this winter's survey, which starts in November 15th through December 15th, and definitely looking for more volunteers, this winter and beyond. For the Central Valley, if you're interested in traveling, there's lots of sites on the coast. Intermountain West work is a bit further, but we need lots of volunteers. We The Shorebird ID skills are really required to lead a survey. We really rely on the awesome experience of folks in Audubon chapters and beyond, and their years of experience identifying shorebirds and being amazing volunteers and community scientists. Also welcome everyone else too. If you're just interested in learning more, seeing a cool site, helping record data, or even being a driver for some of the lead surveyors. So there's my email there. You're welcome to reach out if you're interested. Check out our website more for pointblue at pointblue.org and /PFSS if you're interested in our shorebird survey. So with that, I'm open to take some questions for a while. That's all I really have to present, and I really appreciate you all taking the time to talk about shorebirds. I'd love to talk about them for a few more minutes if we can stick around.
All right, well, thank you, Blake. I am going to check out the chat box and see what we've got. Okay, as of right now, I'm not seeing any questions, so the floor is completely open for anyone who does have any questions. Oh, here we go. Oh, here. Robert asked, what is the least endangered shorebird? That is a very interesting question.
Wow, that's not one we get too often. Killdeer would probably be my first answer off the cuff. They're very, they're habitat generalists, as most of you that know birds well know. You can find them in a lot of different places. They're in wetlands, they're in ag fields, they're in your backyard maybe, they're on the coast, they're in interior. So I think, and there's not a whole lot known about their ecology really, in part because they are so widespread and do seem to do really well in disturbed environments and natural environments. So that's my first guess. What do you think, Robert?
Well, here we go. What is the most abundant shorebird in the Central Valley?
The most abundant shorebird. Another good question. As far as numbers, really the peeps, the Calinger sandpipers lead the pack for the highest numbers. Might depend on the conditions of any given year, but it would likely be the least sandpiper, if not potentially followed closely behind by Dunlin. Longbilled Dowitchers also have really high numbers across the Central Valley. They're a bit more of an enigma to document. They move around a whole lot more. The study on Dunlin and Longbilled Dowitchers, I didn't really show you a lot of the results there, but the Dowitchers moved around a whole lot more than the Dunlin, and longer distances. A lot more of them disappeared out of the valley. So, but as far as overall numbers, it's Dowitchers. I think Dowitchers and Dunlin might actually be the top two, and lead sandpipers right in there as well.
Okay. Let's see. Any other questions, anybody? That's crazy. I actually had a question earlier, and I'm kind of kicking myself right now. I should have just typed it into the chat box when it was in my mind, and it has now completely slipped my mind. So apologize for that. Let's see here. Oh, someone else. Awesome. So I'm pretty sure you mentioned it during the presentation, but I know the Pacific Flyway Shorebird Survey is something that takes place in the fall. Now, how long of a period of time does it, is it like a 2-month period? How long of a period of time do the surveys last?
So in the Central Valley, it's a month window. So from 15th of November to the 15th of December, when We conduct surveys throughout the valley. We really allow folks to conduct their survey at any point throughout that window. It's a bit different. It's a little bit different than on the coast, where we coordinate surveys on the same day at very particular tidal stages, because we know that we'll be hitting that exact same amount of habitat in the landscape for the survey. So they're a bit more coordinated on single days on the coast typically, and then in interior sites, we give a little bit more flexibility. The survey window is a bit later for the Migratory Shorebird Project in the more southerly latitudes in the Southern Hemisphere. And that is actually from January 15th through February 15th.
Okay, makes sense. Okay, and then this is not a question, but is a comment. Okay, we have a comment and then a question. So the comment is from Karen Cobb, and she says, so eye-opening to me to see all this coordination between agencies and groups. And then Dr. Sheriff's, his question is, what project isn't being done you would like to see, or better to scale up something ongoing?
Good question. Well, really, what I hit on at the end was really what we saw as the most urgent need to understand shorebirds, and that was understanding how the different environmental conditions are actually impacting the individuals. We have these survey frameworks to now they're ongoing to document how they're spreading out through the landscapes and how that changes over time. But really understanding how the birds are doing individually is going to give us a window into the other aspect of their ecology, and understanding and potentially either raising the urgency level of conservation of certain species or certain areas, and also really raising, if we find that birds in the valley are in really poor condition, then it'll raise a red flag. If we find the opposite, it'll be like, wow, they're really resilient, and yet they can be in decent condition despite those conditions, or despite really poor habitat in the landscape, and still have what are considered declining populations. Dunlin are of increasing conservation focus and have been now for years, because we've presumed population declines across the flyway. So it will really give us insight into whether or how much or not we need to continue to support the individual birds. And there's been a little bit of a question. So our study on movements, it's like we documented them moving all over the landscape. We have the idea that these movements are not good. It takes energy, right, to move around. And basic shorebird ecology says in the winter, you don't want to move around a lot. You want to just maintain your body, don't take a lot of risks, keep things easy, keep that steady physiological line. And then when you're getting ready for migration and breeding, it changes. So you want to have like this stability throughout the winter to lay a foundation for you to migrate and breed the next year. So we presume moving a lot in the winter is not good for the birds. That said, we don't know that unless we actually start to measure them and measure their physiology and tag them and see what they do. So that would potentially really take shorebird conservation to the next level, to know that if they move, it's not good for them in the winter. You know, we can presume that, but without the hard science, we can't convince the policymakers and the people who are really controlling shorebird habitat and wetland habitat on landscape scales to make sure they're keeping the birds from moving it as much as possible.
Okay, we do have another question. This question is, what are some of the things you think farmers can do to help shorebird species and still have productive crops?
Awesome, that's a good question. I would say that one, Google the Migratory Bird Conservation Partnership and go look at some of our science that has been produced over the last 10 plus years. There are a long list of studies, some of it's pretty jargony, but there's a lot of different, we've tested different small actions. Like there's even something in the rice fields of the Sacramento Valley. When we first started working there, they said, like, well, what if you don't even have any water and you just keep the boards in to, because at the end, you know, certain portions of the fields, they have drainage areas and they essentially just use these wooden boards to hold water when they flood the fields. And it's just like, what if you just don't even receive any water? And instead of just, you know, instead of pulling out the boards all winter, just leave them in. So if it rains a lot, you start capturing water. Does that impact birds? So we had a little study there and found, yeah, when you leave your boards in, you're able to capture some water in the fields. This increases, it actually benefits the fields because it increases decomposition rates of some of the stubble that's remaining in the field without them having to burn. And it also creates shorebird habitat, and other waterbird habitat. There's also examples of really the timing of flooding. That's one of the biggest challenges, particularly in rice fields and some of the other flooded ag. So the rice fields, they can flood post-harvest and have that help their decomposition, but they need to drain the fields off to prep the fields for planting in the spring. And this is right when the birds need them most. So one study that we've done documented what we estimate to be large energy shortfalls for shorebirds, particularly in the spring. And that's because of just what I said. These farmers, they need to get the water off to be able to prep for planting that season. And so what we've done is tested a few different ways to say, hey, let's try not draining them all at once. You can't plow them all at once, right? So let's see if you can just tweak what you're doing a little bit. It's not going to affect your bottom line, but have these fields drained first. Those are the ones you're going to plow first. And, you know, let these sit for a week and then let those go down to once you finish plowing those, then you're moving on to those other ones to plow and prep them. So just working with landowners to say, like, just small changes in your practices can potentially have large benefits to wildlife. And all pretty much all farmers jump on, you know, like water is such a contentious issue. Land conversions a contentious issue throughout the valley, and good PRs is what everybody wants. And the vast majority of farmers too are land stewards, and they not only want, you know, to feed their families, but they also, you know, they also want to help out the environment and wildlife.
Okay. All right, let's see. Do we have any more questions? Looks like that is about it. Awesome. Well, thank you again, Blake, for the wonderful presentation. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. We certainly appreciate it. Just a few quick things before we call it a night. If you're not already, please follow please follow Fresno Audubon on social media. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We also have our YouTube channel. Definitely check that out, especially if you've missed any recent monthly presentation or any recent general meeting presentations. We have those all uploaded on there, and this one will actually be uploaded here in the next few days. We do hope that you'll join us for next month's general meeting, which is scheduled for November 9th. Homer Hansen, who is a passionate and extraordinary birder, will be talking to us about sparrows that overwinter here in our local area. So stay tuned for an announcement and links to registration for that event. Another thing coming up is a virtual tour that Fresno Audubon will be holding at a local birding hotspot sometime later this month. We don't know exactly where that is. We're still kind of figuring that out, but we will make it happen. So stay tuned for an announcement about that via email and social media. And that is about all I have. So thank you again, Blake, and thank you again, everybody, and have a great remainder of your evening and a great remainder of your week. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Sean.